Okay, let's put forth a syllogism of the modal collapse, okay? Premise 1, God exists of absolute necessity. Premise 1, God exists of absolute necessity. Premise 2, God is identical to his act of creation. Therefore, God's creation is of absolute necessity. Now, we're going to say this is let me explain why it doesn't follow. So we're going to agree with the first two premises as Thomas, but we're just going to say that this is an invalid argument. And the way that we can show this is an invalid argument is when we use other forms of the same argument, it leads to false conclusions. For example, if I were to say to you, premise 1, 8 is necessarily greater than 7. Premise 2, the number of planets in our solar system is identical to 8. Conclusion, therefore, the number of planets in our solar system is necessarily greater than 7. It doesn't follow, because there could have been 4 planets in the solar system. It could have been 5. Yeah, so the argument is invalid. Okay, yeah.
The planets are not identical to the number 8. That's where I would argue.
So the point is that necessity is not transitive.
But the problem is for the divine explicit is if God's will is identical to God's essence, doesn't that mean that what God wills becomes necessary?
No, because necessity...
So there's going to be a distinction in God's divine act, like what things that he creates.
Is it a real distinction?
It's going to be a... no, it would be. I think it will be a real distinction. Look, God isn't... This is it. The reason why it doesn't work, and these modal collapse arguments has actually been completely debunked by a guy called Joe Schmidt. The reason is because God's divine act is not deterministic.
Yes, it's indeterminate.
It's indeterministic.
Is it necessary?
No. God's divine act. No, look. So it's true that God can be necessary and that God can create.
Isn't he identical to his act?
God is identical to his act.
Right, his
but
pure act.
His act is not deterministic.
It would be necessary.
If
it's identical to his necessary.
What Christian? Are you Christian?
Yeah, but no.
God is identical to his act, but he can still act through.
I think he's probably an EO. I don't know.
It's not deterministic, it's indeterministic. So if it's indeterministic, it will entail a modal collapse. If it is deterministic, then it will.
Exactly.
Also, this...
Then it would follow that the modal collapse
Non-denominational.
Non-denominational.
But if you say, if you hold that God's divine...
Can I just say quickly?
Oh, yeah, go ahead.
I love you guys. You guys are literally like a breath of fresh air to speak with scholar. That's it. Listen, because even though you're speaking religion, you're talking philosophy at the same time, and I'm loving that. Go on.
Yeah, I really want to understand, but to be honest, I'm not really catching all the...
Basically, look, let's say I'm a necessary being.
Okay.
Now, it's going to be true that what I create would also be necessary in some sense, that I created it. It's going to be necessary. So it's going to be necessary that I created it, but it's being created it will not be.
Yeah, it's necessary by supposition, not by absolute necessity.
But it had to happen, right?
No, God didn't have to create anything.
Yeah, but let me
But the act is necessary.
Yeah, but the point is that God's divine act, that creative act, it doesn't obtain in all worlds. The point is that it's something called rigid designation.
If it's necessary, it should be normal.
Something called rigid designation. When we have a sentence in English, typically what happens is that we designate an object as the privileged thing in a sentence. So when I say, God exists in at least some possible worlds. Well,
That's not the same God I believe in.
I know. I'm
just trying to use it.
When I say God exists in some possible worlds, what I'm saying, or if I say at least God exists in some possible worlds, what I'm saying is that what's being rigidly designated here is God, right?
Okay.
And not the possible worlds. So there are going to be some things that are going to remain true in some contexts of what is going to be rigidly designated, and it's going to be false in other contexts. For example, Superman has a secret identity. Sorry, Clark Kent has a secret identity called Superman, right? Superman and Clark Kent are the same person. But if I ask you the question, does Lois Lane know that Clark Kent can fly? She'll say no. But if I ask you the question, does Lois Lane know that Superman can fly? She'll say
But
yes.
they're identical.
So
Even though they are identical, the thing that's being rigidly designated is going to change.
So this is, I have to just make some pauses here and there. So I feel like when you talked about God being like, if we're going to talk about God, we have to talk about something that exists in all possible worlds necessarily, right? So please,
Don't take on that point. I wasn't saying
okay,
that
so
God
we're
exists.
leaving that now.
Look, God is necessary and he exists in some possible worlds, he exists in all possible worlds.
Yeah, he's just using it as an example.
But what I'm trying to get you to understand is the reason why those modal collapse arguments don't work is that it presupposes that God's divine act is deterministic, and it's not. It doesn't have to be deterministic.
It's necessary.
God's divine act is necessary only because he has created. But he didn't have to create.
It's necessary by supposition. So if you read the Summa Theologia question 19, I think it's article 3, Aquinas will tell you that there's different ways in which things can be necessary. It can be absolutely necessary, nominally necessary, and necessary by supposition. He's saying that God's act of creation is necessary. Creation is necessary in this sense by supposition, which is basically just meaning to say, as long as God creates, creation is necessary, but it's suppositionally necessary. Similarly to if I sit down, I'm necessarily sat down by supposition, but I could stand up. That's the sense in which creation would be necessary, but it's not going to be absolutely necessary.
Okay, so does God's divine act have to create? No.
It doesn't. No.
But it's not an act if it doesn't act, right?
That's the point. God's divine
does it need
act,
to create?
it doesn't have to create.
So are you saying the act can exist without acting?
So God is eternally the creator. Because God has one divine act.
So
And that
you
divine
have
act
to
was
explain to him
simultaneous
what act and potency is.
No, it's not act and potency.
No, it's not act and potency,
He
bro.
thinks act is like you have to.
No, there's no
It wouldn't be
potency in
act,
God.
there's no
bro.
potency.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
What we're saying is that look, this is the argument is trying to say that God's divine act, being identical to God, is necessary in what it creates. But that doesn't follow because the necessity operator is not transitive. It doesn't follow over. It's true that God is necessary, and that in him being identical to his divine act is necessary. But his divine act in creating things, that thing, the object that which it creates, is not deterministic.
Also,
It's indeterministic.
one small point I'd just like to add. Scholars like Chris Tomaszewski, Stephen Nems, people like this that defend divine simplicity against the modal collapse, have actually also offered an argument against theistic personalism, which leads them also to the modal collapse, right? So he parodies this argument. He calls this the tu quoque objection. So you could say God necessarily exists. You would agree with this?
Yes.
God is.
I mean, I want to say that God transcends all our categories, including necessity.
Oh, okay, apophatically, God necessarily exists, though, right?
Well, I mean, if you're going to be strictly apophatic, then I'm not supposed to say, what God, like, I'm not. If I'm supposed to be strictly apophatic, I'm not supposed
Yeah,
to say
but
God is
we're just saying when we say God exists necessarily, we can just say.
But for the sake of the argument, I can grant God is necessary.
Okay,
Sure.
okay. God necessarily exists. God is identical to the Creator. Therefore, necessarily there is a Creator. But you see how obviously that doesn't follow from that, because the form of argument is invalid.
So perhaps we could flip it around. So maybe you could try to show how God actually has free will then. Like, do you believe?
No, okay. So when we say that God has intentionality, we need to be very careful with this, okay? We don't mean God has intentionality in a univocal sense, but we mean it in an analogical sense. So for example, when we have intentionality, we have different brain states. We have different states in which our consciousness might change, right? We change because we're humans, but God does not change. So when we say God has intentionality, we're not going to univocally mean it in the same sense that we mean for humans like you and me. When we say God has intentionality, we're going to mean it in an analogical sense, which just means, in a sense, it's not univocal, nor is it equivocal. So for example, if I say, the wine is good, George is a good man, there's a similarity between the way I'm using good, but it's also different, right? So we're using it in an analogical sense. And the way that we're saying God analogically has intentionality is this. God has the power to create. God created a possible world whilst he had the power to create alternative possible worlds. And in that sense, he has intentionality. Because I could ask you this, right? If I were to ask you, why does God create this world over another, right? We're eventually going to have to posit either some difference in the divine essence which makes him want to create another world over another, or we're going to have to deny something called the difference-making principle. And what the difference-making principle is it's just a principle that says whenever there's a difference in the effect, there necessarily must be a difference in the cause. And we're just going to deny that, and then divine simplicity just works under that model. But you guys would also have the same problem if you deny divine simplicity as well.
So I want to say that, I could be wrong about many things, but right now I want to say that God, most fundamentally, like I have to have a strict apophatic approach to what God is most fundamentally. So I'm not going to say God is...
But you can analogically predicate things.
I'm not going to say God is absolutely simple. I'm not going to say God is necessary. Because I do think, at least from what I understand, because I want to understand your perspective, but I don't understand everything. But from the way I see it, it does seem to lead some kind of necessitarianism if we kind of establish, like if we try to like identify like this is what the most fundamental principle is. It seems hard then to kind of make room for how everything that follows from this principle doesn't, become as necessary as this first.
Yeah, I don't think that follows, because I think the argument is invalid, and I think it relies on presuppositions that the classical theists could just deny it. And I would actually argue all theists should deny this principle if they're not going to be necessitarians. And that principle is the difference-making principle, which I mentioned to you earlier, right? Mm-hmm. If I were to say to you, why does God create one possible world over another? Even as I'm getting Eastern Orthodox vibes, but you could be anything. So I'm just
sometimes I lean there. Sometimes I'm quite. I am generally interested in.
Yeah.
And
so
I look into Eastern sometimes.
So if I were to ask you, as either EO or whatever sect you are, why does God create this world over another? What would your answer to that be?
It would be because of his truly free will decision.
Okay, but how does he have that free will? Because the point is, right?
How he has free will? Well,
yeah. So
I'm kind of like, I know very little about the Scotus. Perhaps I'm misrepresenting them, the Scotus totally. But from what I've heard, maybe you know more about Scotus. But wouldn't they say that like there is a primacy of the will of God? So I'm kind of like.
Well, I'm not a Scotus. I'm a Thomist, but
I do think that there might be something irreducible to the will of God. That is like going like beyond the will of God. Might be unanswered.
I would affirm that God has a will, but what I'm going to say is that what we mean by God can freely create is just that God creates a possible world whilst he has the power to bring about another possible world, right? Because if we're going to say that there's a reason as to why God creates one world over another, that reason is going to be grounded within the essence of God. Which would mean that we're going to have to posit that there are accidents in God's essence.
I think I might reject that principle. I think ultimately it would be grounded in the
energies.
Well, the most fundamental principle, which I have to have a strict apophatic approach to. So I cannot say it's an essence even. I cannot say it's a.
Okay, even as someone who apophatically, because also in our tradition, we hold to apophaticism, right? Okay. We hold to what's the saint the saint that holds to apophaticism a lot? Dionysius the Areopagite, yeah. Okay. So even in our tradition, St. Thomas Aquinas even quotes Dionysius the Areopagite, right? We hold to apophatic theology as well. But what we say is that we can predicate some things of God as long as it's in an analogical sense. Because I think even you would have to grant that, right?